She fought the forbidden pull with every ounce of will, but the intensity in his gaze threatened to unravel her carefully guarded world. Hello, and a warm welcome, amazing viewers. I'm your storyteller, Morgan, and I hope this message finds you well. Before we dive into this incredible journey, if you crave tales of unexpected, soul-stirring romance, of love that defies circumstance and reshapes lives, you're in the perfect place. Prepare for a story of powerful restraint colliding with pure, unforeseen desire, where every unspoken glance holds weight and love blooms in the unlikeliest soil. If you want an unforgettable experience that lingers long after, watch until the very end. You won't regret it. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe, and let's begin this unforgettable story together. Chapter 1. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel that sounded more like shattered bone than stone. Seraphina Vale pressed her forehead against the frigid glass, watching the world bleed into a monochrome nightmare. Blackridge Vale. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Outside, a perpetual twilight reigned, choked by coal dust that hung thick in the air, staining the snow a grimy gray and settling on the sparse skeletal trees like a shroud. The wind, a constant mournful presence, whistled through the narrow valley, carrying the distant rhythmic clang of picks against rock, the heartbeat of this desolate place. Her reflection in the glass was a ghost, high cheekbones stark against deep brown skin, lips pressed into a tight, unforgiving line. Eyes, usually watchful pools of warm intelligence, were now flat, obsidian mirrors reflecting the bleak landscape. They held no tears. Tears were a luxury she'd shed weeks ago, back in the city, when her father's trembling hands had passed her the contract. Not a marriage proposal, a transaction. Seraphina Vale, daughter of a once respected merchant family, traded like chattel to settle unpayable debts. The buyer, Silas Thorne, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and derision, the reclusive coal miner who lived like a hermit in his stone fortress above the pit. The carriage lurched to a halt before a structure that seemed carved from the mountainside itself. It wasn't a house, it was a bulwark. High, windowless stone walls met at sharp angles, capped by a steep slate roof, slick with damp. No welcoming light spilled from the narrow, slit-like windows on the upper floor. The heavy oak door looked like it could withstand a siege. This was her new home, her prison. The driver, a grizzled man whose face was etched with the valley's grime, avoided her eyes as he opened the carriage door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, sharp and gritty, carrying the acrid tang of coal smoke deep into her lungs. She gathered her skirts, fine wool already dulling with the pervasive dust, and stepped down, her posture instinctively straightening, and invisible armor clicking into place. Pride was all she had left. The massive door groaned open, revealing not warmth but a deeper chill. A cavernous hall stretched before her, flagstone floors uneven and cold, rough-hewn stone walls absorbing what little light filtered through high, narrow windows. The air smelled of damp earth, ancient stone, and something else, loneliness. A profound echoing silence pressed in, broken only by the persistent howl of the wind outside. He emerged from the gloom like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. Silas Thorne. He matched the starkness of his surroundings, lean but radiating a contained, dangerous strength. He wore simple, rough-spun trousers and a thick work shirt, both coated in a fine layer of gray dust that clung to the fabric and powdered his stubbled jaw. His hair, a dark, unruly mane, fell across a high forehead, but it was his eyes that arrested her. Pale gray, shockingly clear, like chips of winter ice or the heart of an uncut diamond. They swept over her, a brief, impersonal assessment devoid of warmth or welcome. There was no smile, no greeting. Miss Vale. His voice was a low rumble, unexpected in the silence, rough like stones grinding together. It held no inflection. Mr. Thorne. Her own voice was cool, steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. She met his gaze, refusing to flinch under that unnerving pale stare. It was a challenge, silent but acknowledged. He blinked first, his gaze flicking down to the single trunk the driver deposited just inside the door. Your rooms are upstairs, first door on the right. He gestured vaguely towards a stone staircase spiraling into dimness. Cook left stew on the hob. Help yourself. He turned away, his movements economical, almost soundless on the stones. The heavy door thudded shut behind the departing driver, sealing them into the suffocating silence. Rooms, stew, as if she were a boarder, not a wife acquired by contract. The resentment, a low simmer since the carriage ride began, flared hot and bright. She was a practical woman, raised on hardship, but this deliberate coldness, this reduction to mere function, stung her carefully guarded pride. She lifted her chin higher. Survival, duty, that was her mantra now. She would manage his sparse household, fulfill the bare minimum this transaction demanded, and find her dignity within those confines. She refused to be cowed by his stone walls or his icy silence. Her room was a cell, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a single chair, and a small unadorned wardrobe. The only concession to light was a narrow window overlooking the bleak expanse of the mining settlement below, smoke curling from chimneys like desperate grey fingers clawing at the oppressive sky. She unpacked her meager belongings, sensible dresses, sturdy boots, a few cherished books, placing each item with deliberate care, establishing order in the chaos. The silence pressed in, broken only by the wind's lament and the distant ceaseless clang of industry. The days settled into a grim rhythm. Silas Thorne was a ghost haunting his own fortress. He rose before dawn, leaving the house while darkness still clung to the valley. He returned long after dusk, coated head to toe in the valley's grey grime, smelling of sweat, coal and cold earth. He ate alone, silently, often standing by the large hearth in the cavernous main hall, shoveling stew into his mouth with mechanical efficiency, before vanishing into the depths of the house, a room she'd never seen, always locked. He avoided her meticulously. If they passed in a corridor, he would angle his body away, eyes fixed straight ahead. His presence was a cold draught, a brief disturbance in the heavy air before the silence swallowed him again. Seraphina, however, was not idle. She attacked the neglected house with fierce pragmatism. She scrubbed flagstones until her knuckles bled, banishing layers of dust and neglect. She aired musty linens, beat rugs until clouds of grey choked the courtyard air, and organized the sparse pantry with military precision. She cooked simple meals, leaving his portion covered on the hob. She moved through the cold, echoing rooms with economical grace, her dark skin a stark, vibrant contrast against the unyielding grey stone. She was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, her pride manifesting in the spotless surfaces and the scent of lye soap that slowly began to battle the damp. Forced proximity in such echoing silence bred a terrible intimacy of observation. Despite her resentment, Seraphina found her eyes drawn to him, cataloguing details against her will. She noted the sheer physicality of him, the powerful set of his shoulders beneath the rough shirt, the defined muscles of his forearms revealed when he pushed his sleeves up to wash at the stone sink in the scullery, the surprising leanness of his waist. She saw the immense strength in his hands, large and calloused, yet also a startling precision when he repaired a loose hinge on a cupboard door one evening, his movements deft and focused. It was an unsettling contradiction, brute force harnessed with unexpected finesse. And his eyes, those pale, unsettling eyes. On the rare occasions their paths crossed unavoidably, him entering the hall as she was leaving the kitchen, she felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't lingering, but it was intense, a flicker of something unreadable in those icy depths before the shutters slammed down and he looked away. It wasn't desire, not as she understood it. It felt more like assessment or conflict, a silent battle waged behind that impassive facade. One afternoon, wrestling with stiff, dust-laden curtains in the seldom-used parlor, she finally broke the suffocating silence with a barb wrapped in practicality. Does the sun ever penetrate this fortress, Mr. Thorne? Or is perpetual gloom part of the aesthetic? She didn't turn, focusing on the stubborn fabric. He'd been passing the doorway, pausing at her voice. A beat of silence stretched, thick with coal dust. Then his rough voice, closer than expected. The windows face east, sunlight's brief and weak. He stepped into the room, his presence immediately filling the space, making it feel smaller. He reached up, his arm brushing against hers as he grasped the heavy curtain rod above her head. Seraphina froze, the unexpected contact sending a jolt through her, like touching a live wire. His scent, coal dust, cold air, and something uniquely male, earthy and sharp, enveloped her. He gave the rod a sharp tug, and the curtain ring screeched in protest, finally yielding. A weak shaft of grayish light spilled onto the floor. There, he stepped back abruptly, his gaze fixed on the newly revealed window, not on her. Weak light, but light. He turned to leave. Charming, Seraphina murmured, smoothing her skirt, her heart pounding against her ribs. Though I suspect the dust will simply have a better view now. A sound, almost like a choked breath, escaped him. Was it amusement? Annoyance? She couldn't tell. He paused at the doorway, his broad back to her. Dust is inevitable here, Miss Vale. Like the cold. Best get used to it. He disappeared into the shadowed hall. Miss Vale. Always Miss Vale. Never Seraphina. Never wife. The reminder of their transactional reality was a cold splash of water. Yet, the phantom warmth where his arm had brushed hers, lingered. And that sound, had it almost been a laugh? It was the first flicker of anything resembling human interaction. It unsettled her more than his silence. The next day, she found a small, unexpected anomaly in the stark walled courtyard, where only hard-packed dirt and a few stubborn weeds survived. A single white rose bloomed defiantly against the base of the stone wall.
Its petals were pristine, impossibly pure against the pervasive grey. Seraphina knelt, touching one velvety petal. How did it survive? Who had planted it? The image of Silas Thorne tending something so delicate seemed ludicrous. Yet, there it was, a tiny spark of beauty in the desolation. She left it untouched, a silent tribute to resilience. The forced proximity continued to weave its unsettling spell. One morning, gathering laundry left in a heap near the scullery door, his work clothes, she picked up his rough shirt. It was still faintly warm from his body, carrying that complex scent of coal, sweat, and the underlying earthiness that was uniquely him. The texture was coarse against her palm, yet as she held it, a strange intimacy flooded her. This fabric had touched his skin, absorbed his labor. A flush crept up her neck, unwelcome and confusing. She dropped the shirt as if it had burned her. Ridiculous, it's just laundry. Later, she prepared a simple lunch. He entered the kitchen silently, heading for the sink to wash the ingrained grime from his hands and forearms. She watched, unnoticed, as the water sluiced away the grey, revealing skin paler than she expected beneath the dirt, corded with muscle and sinew, marked by old faint scars and fresh nicks. There was a raw strength there, yes, but also a vulnerability in the revealed flesh. He scrubbed with a ferocity that spoke of more than just removing dirt. When he finished, he dried his hands meticulously on a rough towel, the movements precise, almost fastidious. He caught her looking then, those pale eyes locked onto hers across the cold stone kitchen. For a suspended moment, neither looked away. The air crackled, thick with unspoken tension. Seraphina's breath hitched. It wasn't assessment now. It was something hotter, darker, more dangerous. A flicker of awareness, hunger. Then, as swiftly as it appeared, it vanished. He dropped his gaze, muttered something about checking the stores, and was gone, leaving her gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The image of his clean, powerful forearms seared into her mind. Why? The question screamed silently within her. Why did her pulse race when he passed? Why did the memory of that brief, intense gaze send heat pooling low in her belly? He was coarse, uncommunicative, her jailer in this stone cage. He represented the depths to which her family's fortunes had sunk, the sacrifice she'd been forced to make. Desire for him was illogical, humiliating, a betrayal of her own pride and circumstance. She clenched her fists, nails biting into her palms. Control, maintain control. Dulse bled into one another, marked only by the grinding routine and the deepening chill. Resentment, and that treacherous, unwanted curiosity waged a silent war within her. She began to listen for the heavy tread of his boots, the groan of the front door announcing his return. She found herself noting the subtle signs of his presence, a chair slightly out of place, the lingering scent of coal and cold air in a room he'd passed through, the faint warmth left on the kettle handle. One rare afternoon, a weak sun struggled through the perpetual coal smog haze, casting a pale, watery light through the tall window in the main hall. Exhausted from wrestling a heavy rug, Seraphina leaned back against the sun-warmed stone of the window ledge. The heat, feeble but genuine, seeped through the fabric of her dress, a small comfort against the ever-present chill. She closed her eyes for a moment, tilting her head back slightly, letting the weak light touch her face. The tension of constant vigilance, of suppressed anger and confusing attraction, eased minutely. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of her neck, tracing a path over her collarbone. The heavy front door groaned open. Silas Thorne stepped inside, shutting out the wind's howl. He was coated as usual, in a fine grey powder, his expression hidden in shadow beneath the brim of his work cap. He started towards the stairs, his movements automatic, then stopped dead. Seraphina sensed his stillness, a sudden vacuum in the room's atmosphere. She opened her eyes. He wasn't looking at her face. His pale grey eyes were fixed, with an intensity that felt like a physical blow, on the curve of her neck where the sweat glistened in the weak sunlight, on the vulnerable line of her exposed collarbone against the rough stone. The look was raw, stripped bare. It wasn't impersonal assessment, nor was it the conflicted awareness she'd glimpsed before. This was pure, unadulterated hunger, a desperate, forbidden wanting that radiated from him in waves, hot enough to sear through the room's chill. It lasted only a heartbeat, a silent detonation in the dusty air. Seraphina froze. Every nerve ending screamed. The warmth of the stone against her back turned abruptly cold. The air crackled, thick with the unsaid, the impossible. She saw the rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his calloused hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles standing out white against the grime. Then, as if burned, he wrenched his gaze away. He turned on his heel with a violence that sent a small puff of coal dust rising from his boots. He didn't go upstairs. He strode back towards the heavy front door, yanked it open, and vanished back into the grey afternoon without a word, slamming it shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the stone fortress. Silence crashed back, heavier and more profound than before. Seraphina remained pressed against the cold stone ledge, the phantom heat of his gaze still branding her skin where the sun had touched it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. The resentment, the duty, the pride, they were still there, a bedrock beneath her feet. But now, fissured by that single scorching look, something else surged through the cracks. Not just confusion, not just anger, a terrifying, forbidden spark of answering heat, and the chilling realization the stone fortress held more danger than just cold and isolation. The greatest threat stood 6 feet tall, covered in coal dust, and looked at her like she was water in a desert. Her carefully constructed control felt suddenly perilously thin. The silent battle lines had just been redrawn, and the enemy was no longer just circumstance. It was the fierce, unexpected pull towards the man who owned her contract, her prison, and now, unwittingly, the treacherous landscape of her own desire.
Chapter 2. The slam of the heavy door echoed long after Silas Thorne vanished back into the grey afternoon. It wasn't just wood hitting stone. It felt like the ceiling of a tomb or the crack of a starting pistol. Seraphina remained frozen against the cold window ledge, the phantom brand of his gaze still searing the sweat-dampened skin of her neck. The weak sunlight suddenly felt like a harsh interrogation lamp. Hunger, that's what she'd seen. Raw, undisguised, and terrifyingly focused. Not on Seraphina Vale, the inconvenient burden, but on her, the woman, the vulnerability exposed by sunlight and exhaustion. Shame warred with a treacherous, unwelcome thrill. Shame that such a look, from him, could ignite an answering flicker low in her belly. Shame that her pride, her carefully constructed armor of resentment, felt scorched and brittle under its intensity. The thrill was worse, a primal recognition of power met with power, a dangerous spark leaping a gap she'd sworn to keep vast. He didn't return until deep into the night. Seraphina heard the heavy, careful tread on the stairs, the deliberate quietness speaking volumes. He was avoiding the sound of his own presence. The next morning, the avoidance was absolute. He left before first light, a shadow melting into the pre-dawn gloom. The air in the stone fortress felt charged, brittle, as if the very dust motes hanging in the weak morning light were holding their breath. Seraphina threw herself into work with a ferocity bordering on desperation. She attacked the neglected corners of the lodge, a dusty linen closet, a pantry shelf thick with cobwebs. Physical exertion was her bulwark against the unsettling turmoil within. She scrubbed, polished, rearranged, imposing her own order on Silas Thorne's chaotic isolation. Yet her senses were hyper-alert, attuned to every creak, every shift in the oppressive silence. She found herself cataloguing the small signs of his passage, the specific pattern of coal dust tracked near the door, the lingering scent of cold air and damp wool in the hall long after he'd left, the faint indentation on a cushion in the chair he occasionally used by the fire. The white rose in the courtyard became her talisman. She visited it daily, a small defiant act of hope. One morning, she found a single petal detached, lying pristine on the grey dirt. She picked it up, its velvety softness a shock against her work-roughened fingertips. Carrying it inside, she placed it between the pages of her sturdiest book, a silent preservation of beauty in this grim place. Days bled into a week. Silas maintained his distance with military precision, yet his presence, paradoxically, felt heavier, more charged. Seraphina's initial resentment, while still a bedrock, was now fissured by an insidious curiosity. Who was this man? The coarse minor facade felt increasingly inadequate, a poorly fitting cloak. She recalled the startling precision in his calloused hands repairing the hinge, the unexpected depth in those pale eyes when they weren't shuttered, the almost fastidious way he washed the grime from his skin. One blustery afternoon, wrestling a heavy bolt of dark fabric she'd found intended perhaps for curtains decades ago to cover the coldest windows, her hand slipped. The rough edge of the rolled fabric scraped sharply across her knuckles, drawing a thin line of blood. She hissed, dropping the bolt with a thud, pressing her hand to her mouth. Problem? His voice, rough and low, came from the doorway of the dim parlor. He must have just returned. Fine grey dust still powdered his shoulders, his pale eyes watchful in the gloom. Seraphina instinctively hid her injured hand behind her back, straightening her spine. Merely a disagreement with the interior decor, Mr. Thorne. The fortress seems resistant to comfort. He stepped into the room, his gaze not on her face but flicking to the hand she'd hidden. Let me see. It wasn't a request, it was a quiet command. It's nothing, she insisted, her voice tighter than intended. A scratch. He was suddenly closer, the scent of coal dust and cold air enveloping her. He didn't touch her, but held out his own hand, palm up expectant. His gaze was unreadable, fixed on the spot where her hand was hidden. The air crackled. Reluctantly, heart pounding, she slowly brought her hand forward. The thin red line stood out starkly against her dark skin. His calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed hers as he took her hand to examine the shallow cut. The contact was electric. Seraphina's breath caught. His touch was warm, rough, yet his hold was careful, almost reverent. He studied the wound, his brow furrowed. Needs cleaning. Dirt here is corrosive. He released her hand as abruptly as he'd taken it, turning towards the door. Kitchen, water, now. He didn't wait for her to follow. Seraphina stood frozen for a moment, the ghost of his touch burning on her skin, the rough command echoing in the quiet room. She trailed after him, the heavy fabric forgotten. In the cold kitchen, he pumped water into the basin, the rhythmic squeak loud in the silence. He gestured for her hand again over the basin. This time, she offered it without hesitation, a strange calm settling over her. He cupped her hand in his larger one, pouring clean, cold water over the cut. His thumb, calloused pad surprisingly soft along the edge, brushed away a speck of dirt with meticulous care. Seraphina watched his bent head, the dark strands of hair falling forward, the intense concentration on his face as he tended to this minor injury. The intimacy of it was staggering, his large, work-roughened hands cradling hers, the cool water, the focused silence. It felt more binding than any contract. There, he released her hand, drying his own on a rough towel. He didn't meet her eyes. Try not to wrestle the draperies again. He turned to leave. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it. He paused, his back to her, shoulders rigid. Why what? Why bother? Seraphina pressed, the confusion and the unwanted attraction warring within her, lending her voice an edge. It's just a scratch, hardly worth the attention of the lord of this particular domain. His pale eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in their depths beyond ice or hunger. It looked like wariness, and a spark of something dangerously close to anger. Even scratches fester in this place, Miss Vale, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Neglect has consequences, you should know that. The barb about her family's situation, unspoken but clear, landed with precision. He held her gaze for a charged second, then walked out, leaving her standing by the sink, hand tingling, feeling inexplicably chastened, and more confused than ever. The forced proximity became a crucible. Seraphina found reasons to be in the main hall when he returned, ostensibly mending by the meager fire, or studying a ledger she'd found, filled with surprisingly neat, precise script detailing mundane supplies. She felt the weight of his gaze as he passed, brief but intense, like a physical touch grazing her skin. He, in turn, seemed to linger longer in rooms she occupied, ostensibly checking the fire, or inspecting a window latch, his presence a constant, brooding pressure. One evening, he returned later than usual, the pervasive coal dust seeming thicker, darker on his clothes. He moved to the sink, his movements heavy with exhaustion. Seraphina was at the table, shelling dried beans, the rhythmic tink of each bean hitting the bowl the only sound besides the crackle of the fire. She watched his reflection in the dark kitchen window as he bent over the basin, scrubbing at his hands and forearms with the same fierce intensity. Water sluiced away the grey, revealing the pale, powerful musculature beneath, the network of old scars and fresh abrasions. He splashed water on his face, running wet hands through his dark hair, pushing it back. For a moment, his reflection was clear in the glass, the sharp lines of his jaw, the surprising fineness of his nose beneath the dust, the stark intensity of his pale eyes fixed unseeingly ahead. Stripped of the grime, he looked younger, more vulnerable, yet somehow more dangerous. He caught her watching him in the reflection, their eyes locked in the dark glass. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken words, with the memory of his touch on her hand, with the raw hunger she'd witnessed. Seraphina's fingers stilled on a bean, his reflection held hers, that pale gaze burning through the glass, through the dimness. Neither moved. The tink of the next bean dropping into the bowl sounded unnaturally loud. Slowly, deliberately, Silas reached for the rough towel, never breaking eye contact in the reflection. He dried his face, his neck, his gaze never leaving hers. It was a silent challenge, an acknowledgement of the tension crackling between them. Seraphina found her voice, aiming for nonchalance, hitting something far more brittle. The water's cold, I trust, seems to have quite the bracing effect. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He lowered the towel, his real face turning towards her now, away from the reflection. The intensity was even more potent face to face. Cold clarifies, he stated, his voice rough, cuts through the fog. His eyes swept over her, lingering on the curve of her neck where her pulse fluttered wildly, then meeting her gaze again. Don't you find— She forced a brittle smile. I find fog often conceals unpleasant truths, Mr. Thorne. Sometimes clarity is overrated. She picked up another bean, her fingers trembling slightly, like discovering a rose growing in a coal yard, beautiful but terribly out of place. Doomed, perhaps. He took a step closer to the table. The scent of clean skin and damp hair replaced the coal dust, a disconcertingly intimate aroma. Some things are tougher than they look, Miss Vale, he murmured, his gaze dropping to the white rose petal she'd absent-mindedly placed beside the bean bowl. He reached out, not touching it, but his finger hovered over its velvety surface. They find a way, against the odds. His eyes lifted to hers, holding a question, a dare. Seraphina's breath hitched, the space between them vibrated. Or perhaps, she countered, her voice barely above a whisper, they simply haven't been crushed yet. She held his gaze, the unspoken reference to their situation, to the look he'd given her, hanging heavy in the air. He withdrew his hand, clenching it slowly at his side. A shadow crossed his face, the shutters slamming down once more. Perhaps, the word was clipped, final. He turned, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the beans, the rose petal, and the echoing silence that now thrummed with unresolved tension. The next morning, seeking refuge from the charged atmosphere, Seraphina decided to tackle the locked door at the end of the upstairs corridor. She'd noticed it before, heavier than the others, iron-bound, always firmly shut. Curiosity, a dangerous companion lately, gnawed at her. Maybe it was a storage room. Perhaps it held answers about the man who seemed less a miner and more an enigma wrapped in coal dust. She tried the handle, locked as expected. She examined the mechanism, old, heavy, but perhaps she remembered a set of rusted keys she'd found in a dusty drawer while cleaning. Retrieving them, she tried several. The third key, large and ornate, slid in with surprising ease. With a click that echoed loudly in the empty corridor, the lock turned. She pushed the heavy door open slowly. Dank air, smelling of old paper and something vaguely metallic, wafted out. She stepped inside, expecting coal sacks or discarded furniture. Her breath stopped. Coal sacks. This was a world away from the gritty reality of Blackridge Vale. The room was vast, stretching back into shadowed recesses. Walls of dark, polished wood rose to a high ceiling, not rough timber, but rich mahogany or ebony, gleaming in the weak light filtering through high, narrow, clean windows. One entire wall was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines embossed with gold leaf that glinted faintly. A massive desk, carved from the same dark wood, dominated the center of the room, its surface inlaid with intricate patterns of lighter wood. An ornate globe stood beside it. The air was still, hushed, like a cathedral, but it was the opposite wall that truly stole her reason. It wasn't bookshelves. It was display cases, lit from within by some unseen source, and inside, resting on plush black velvet, diamonds, not tiny sparkles, raw stones, some as large as her fist, others meticulously cut and faceted, catching the faint light and fracturing it into blinding shards of icy fire. They lay in nests of velvet, glittering with an inner light that seemed independent of the weak sun outside. White diamonds, clear as frozen water, canary yellows glowing like captured sunlight, deep blues like midnight oceans, pinks like the blush on a rose petal. They pulsed with cold, mesmerizing beauty, radiating pure, concentrated wealth, a fortune beyond imagining, casually displayed in this hidden sanctum within a stone fortress above a coal mine. Seraphina staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. The air left her lungs in a shocked gasp. Coal miner. The words were a bitter, ludicrous joke. This was an empire, hidden, deliberately concealed. He wasn't poor, he controlled this. While her family scraped and begged, while she had been sold like chattel to settle debts he could have wiped away with a single one of these stones. Fury, white-hot and righteous, surged through her, momentarily eclipsing the awe, the deception. He had let her believe him destitute, let her scrub his floors and cook his meals in resentful poverty, while he sat surrounded by this. The cold fire of the diamonds mirrored the icy rage, freezing her blood. She stepped further into the room, her boots silent on the thick patterned rug that covered the stone floor. Her eyes darted from case to case, the sheer scale of the wealth battering her senses. On the desk lay ledgers, their pages filled not with coal tallies, but with columns of figures that made her head swim, maps marked with locations far beyond Blackridge Vale. The door creaked softly behind her. Seraphina whirled around. Silas Thorne stood framed in the doorway. He wasn't coated in dust. He must have been in another part of the house. He wore dark trousers and a clean, finely woven white shirt, the sleeves rolled up, revealing his powerful forearms. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but his pale gray eyes, they weren't icy. They were burning, fixed on her with an intensity that dwarfed even the diamonds. He didn't look angry about the intrusion. He looked exposed, utterly vulnerable. The powerful, controlled heir stood revealed, not just in his wealth but in the raw, conflicted emotions warring in his gaze as he looked at her standing amidst the proof of his colossal lie.
For a long, agonizing moment, they simply stared at each other across the opulent room. The silence wasn't just heavy. It was charged with the shattering of illusions, the roar of betrayal, and the terrifying, undeniable current of the attraction that had been building between them in the shadows of the coal-dusted world outside. The glittering diamonds cast fractured light across his face, highlighting the sharp planes, the tension in his jaw. Seraphina's fury warred with a horrifying, dawning understanding of the isolation this room represented, and the impossible, forbidden desire reflected in his eyes. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The truth, cold and brilliant as the stones surrounding them, lay bare. The miner was a myth, the heir was real, and the woman he'd bought, the woman he'd watched with such hunger, now knew exactly who and what he was. The air crackled, thick with the debris of shattered resolve and the terrifying promise of what came next.
Chapter 3. The air in the diamond-lined study didn't just crackle, it froze solid. Seraphina stood amidst the obscene glitter of Silas Thorne's hidden empire, the cold fire of the stones reflecting the icy fury in her own eyes. Across the room, Silas was a statue carved from tension, his pale gaze fixed on her, stripped bare, not just of his miner's grime, but of the very lie that had shackled her. The opulent silence screamed with betrayal. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply absorbed her presence in this forbidden space, the vulnerability in his eyes warring with the fierce possessiveness of a cornered predator guarding its hoard. Seraphina found her voice first, sharp as a shard of diamond. "A coal miner," she stated, the words dripping with acid disbelief. She gestured wildly at the glittering cases. "Is this the yield of the Blackridge pit, Mr. Thorne, or merely the spoils of deception?" Her gaze swept over the ledgers, the maps, the staggering evidence of wealth that mocked her sacrifice, her family's desperation. "Did you enjoy it? Watching me scrub your floors? Believing myself chained to poverty while you basked in this?" The fury choked her, hot and suffocating. Silas flinched, almost imperceptibly. His jaw clenched, the muscle jumping. When he spoke, his voice was a low rasp, stripped of its usual rough command, revealing a raw edge she'd never heard. Enjoyment wasn't the point. He took a single step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "This room, it's a vault, not just for stones, a prison of your own making." Seraphina shot back, crossing her arms defensively, though it felt futile against the onslaught of his presence and the dazzling accusatory wealth. "And you decided to add a living ornament. Was I part of the collection? Reluctant bride, slightly used." A flash of something like pain crossed his face, quickly masked by a resurgence of that chilling control. "You were a transaction," he stated flatly, the word a deliberate barb. "Arranged by others. I offered what was asked." He gestured vaguely towards the door, towards the coal-dusted world outside. "The life out there, it's a shield. This," his gaze flickered around the room, encompassing the diamonds, the isolation, "is the burden. A burden." Seraphina laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the polished wood. "Forgive me if I find it difficult to weep for the plight of the Diamond Emperor in his gilded cage. My family starved, Silas, while you sat on a mountain of ice." Using his first name felt dangerous, a violation of the careful distance she'd maintained, but the rage demanded it. He recoiled as if struck, hearing his name on her lips, laced with such venom, seemed to pierce his armor. His pale eyes darkened, storm clouds gathering. "You know nothing of my burdens." The words burst from him, rough and strained, shattering the careful quiet of the room. "Nothing of the chains that come with this." He slammed a fist down on the polished desk, the sound like a gunshot, making Seraphina jump. A raw diamond, displayed nearby, seemed to shiver in its velvet nest. "The isolation, the suspicion, the constant calculation. It's a different kind of poverty, Miss Vale, one that grinds you down to dust just the same." He drew a ragged breath, visibly struggling to regain composure. "You think hiding this was cruelty? It was. Preservation. For me. For this place." Seraphina stared at him, the righteous fury momentarily stalled by the raw desperation in his voice, the unexpected glimpse of the man beneath the myth. The diamond heir looked suddenly, terrifyingly human, and infinitely more dangerous. The forbidden pull she'd fought so hard against surged, a treacherous undertow beneath the storm of her anger. His isolation mirrored her own enforced solitude in this stone fortress. The realization was unwelcome, disarming. He turned away abruptly, pacing towards the diamond displays, his broad back rigid. "Leave," he commanded, his voice rough again, but lacking its former certainty. It sounded more like a plea wrapped in bark. "Forget you saw this." The dismissal stung, reigniting her defiance. Forget, she took a step closer, drawn despite herself. How exactly does one forget an empire hidden behind coal dust? Does the deception extend to your conscience as well? She stopped near the desk, her fingers brushing the cool, smooth wood, deliberately close to the ledger filled with his meticulous script detailing unimaginable wealth. Or is that simply another facet you keep locked away? He whirled around. The storm in his eyes was fully unleashed now, a turbulent mix of anger, shame, and that terrifying, unnameable hunger she'd witnessed by the window. It was directed solely at her. My conscience, he growled, taking 2 long strides towards her, closing the distance, is none of your concern. Our agreement stands. Your role remains the same. Manage the household. He spat the last word, emphasizing the boundary, the cage he was desperately trying to rebuild around them. He loomed over her, the scent of clean linen, and something uniquely masculine, cedar, replacing the coal dust, an intoxicating contrast to his palpable fury. Stay out of places that don't concern you. Seraphina refused to look away, refused to cower. The heat radiating from him was a tangible force. Places like your life, Mr. Thorne, she challenged, her voice low and steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Or places like your mind. Both seem rather inaccessible, fortified, much like this fortress. She tilted her head, meeting his stormy gaze. Though even the thickest walls develop cracks, it seems. His hand shot out, not to strike, but to grip the edge of the desk beside her head, caging her in. His knuckles were white. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the pulse beating rapidly at the base of his throat. Some cracks, he breathed, his voice a rough whisper that scraped along her nerves, are best left unexplored. They lead to collapses. The air between them vibrated. Seraphina could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. The diamonds glittered coldly, witnesses to this charged standoff. The unspoken attraction was a living thing, coiling around them, fed by fury and proximity. Her own breath came shallow and fast. To look away felt like surrender. To stay felt like stepping off a cliff. She held his gaze, the challenge hanging in the suffocating air. And some collapses, she whispered back, the words escaping before she could cage them, might be the only way to find solid ground. For a heartbeat, eternity stretched. His pale eyes searched hers, the storm within them swirling with something desperate, almost pleading, before hardening back into icy resolve. He pushed himself away from the desk with a force that rocked it slightly, turning his back on her once more. Get out, he repeated, the command final, brittle. Seraphina fled, not in fear, but in a tumult of fury, confusion, and a terrifying, exhilarating sense of having stared into the abyss and seen it stare back with eyes full of forbidden fire. The stone fortress felt different after that. The silence wasn't just empty, it was thick with the residue of their confrontation, the unsaid words, the exposed truths, and the undeniable, electric pull that hummed beneath the surface. They moved around each other like charged particles, orbits tightening, collisions inevitable. Silas spent even longer hours away, his returns later, his exhaustion deeper, etched into the lines around his eyes. He avoided the main rooms, taking meals alone in the kitchen, or disappearing immediately into his study. Though Seraphina noted the lock clicked with extra finality now, yet his avoidance felt different, charged, defensive. When their paths did cross, her descending the stairs as he entered the hall, him passing the kitchen door as she worked, the glances weren't just brief, they were collisions. His pale eyes would lock onto hers, holding for a fraction longer than necessary, a silent communication of shared secrets and simmering tension. Seraphina met them head-on, her own gaze reflecting the storm within her, the lingering fury over his deception, the unwelcome empathy for his isolation, and the persistent treacherous heat that his nearness ignited. One evening, a week after the library confrontation, the heavy front door crashed open with unusual violence, shattering the tense quiet. Seraphina, mending by the hearth, startled, dropping her needle. Silas stumbled in, not coated in the usual fine grey dust, but spattered with something darker. Mud, thick and wet, clung to his boots and trousers, but it was the vivid crimson staining the sleeve of his rough work shirt that seized her breath. Blood, a lot of it, soaking through the fabric from forearm to elbow. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his face pale beneath the grime, etched with pain and exhaustion. His breathing was ragged. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed dully on the stone floor. Duty warred with resentment, with confusion, with the terrifying pull. Duty won. Pragmatism. She couldn't let him bleed out on the flagstones, regardless of the diamonds or the lies. She rose, her movements automatic. Sit, she commanded, her voice surprisingly steady. She pointed to the heavy wooden chair by the fire. By the fire, now. He blinked, as if surprised by her presence, by the command. For a moment, he looked like he might refuse, might stumble past her to his locked study. Then, a wave of dizziness seemed to hit him. He swayed,
pushing off the doorframe and staggering towards the chair. He slumped into it heavily, his head falling back against the high wooden back, eyes closing. A low groan escaped his lips. Seraphina moved quickly. She fetched a basin of warm water from the kitchen, clean cloths, and the small stash of bandages and salve she'd found in a cupboard. Kneeling beside the chair, the firelight casting flickering shadows, she hesitated for only a second. This was necessary, clinical. She reached for his injured arm. His eyes snapped open as her fingers brushed the sodden fabric of his sleeve. That pale gaze, clouded with pain, locked onto hers. The intensity was immediate, primal. He didn't pull away. He watched her, his breath still ragged, but his focus entirely on her face. Carefully, she pushed the torn, blood-soaked sleeve up his forearm. The wound beneath was ugly, a deep, jagged gash running several inches along the muscle, still oozing dark red. It needed cleaning and stitching. Seraphina swallowed, her own hands trembling slightly now, not from fear of the wound, but from the intimacy of the act, the sheer vulnerability of him allowing her this close. She dipped a cloth in the warm water, wringing it out. "This will hurt," she warned, her voice low. "Everything hurts," he murmured, his gaze never leaving hers. The words held layers, the wound, the confrontation, the isolation, the unbearable tension between them. She pressed the cloth gently to the edge of the wound. He hissed, his body tensing, his free hand gripping the arm of the chair until the wood groaned. But he didn't pull away. He held her gaze, his jaw clenched, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and a depth of pain that went far beyond the physical. Seraphina worked methodically, rinsing the cloth, carefully cleaning away mud and congealed blood, revealing the angry red flesh beneath. The coppery tang of blood mixed with the scent of damp wool, smoke, and his own unique earthy aroma. It was heady, intimate. Her fingers against his skin felt every tremor that ran through him, every stifled gasp he tried to swallow. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the drip of water into the basin, and their ragged breathing, his from pain, hers from the sheer intensity of the moment. She felt the heat radiating from his skin beneath her touch, the powerful muscles of his forearm taut with strain. His vulnerability was a palpable thing, cracking open the icy control he wielded like a weapon. As she carefully dabbed at a particularly stubborn patch of dirt near the deepest part of the gash, her fingertip inadvertently grazed the edge of the raw flesh. A feather-light touch, barely there. Silas flinched violently, a sharp intake of breath. But it wasn't just pain. His uninjured hand shot out, not to push her away, but to engulf hers. His fingers closed around her wrist, warm, strong, calloused, halting her movement completely. The contact was electric, a jolt that seared through her entire being. His grip wasn't painful, but it was desperate, possessive, iron-strong, yet trembling slightly. There was only the feel of his hand on her wrist, the heat of his skin beneath her other hand still resting near the wound, the frantic pulse she could feel thrumming where his thumb pressed against her inner wrist, matching the wild rhythm of her own heart. Her gaze snapped up to his. His pale eyes were no longer icy, no longer clouded with pain. They were molten silver, blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. All the hunger she'd glimpsed, all the conflict, the fury, the isolation, it coalesced into a single, undeniable inferno. It wasn't just desire, it was need, a desperate, consuming, soul-deep yearning that stripped away every pretense, every barrier, every lie. He looked at her as if she were the only source of light in his perpetually frozen world. Words were impossible, unnecessary. The months of resentment, the weeks of charged tension, the shattering revelation, the careful walls they'd both built, they dissolved in the heat of that gaze. The silent battle was over. Resistance was ash. Seraphina didn't pull away. She leaned infinitesimally closer, her free hand moving of its own volition, her fingertips brushing the tense line of his jaw, smearing a trace of drying blood. A silent question, a surrender. His restraint shattered. A low guttural sound tore from his throat, part groan, part surrender. His hand on her wrist tightened, pulling her forward, off her knees, towards him. His other arm, the injured one forgotten, swept around her waist, hauling her roughly against him, onto his lap. The chair creaked in protest. The world tilted. Then his mouth was on hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't tentative. It was a claiming, a desperate fusion. His lips were surprisingly soft, yet demanding, moving against hers with a hunger that mirrored the fire in his eyes. Seraphina gasped against his mouth, the shock giving way instantly to a surge of answering need, so fierce it stole her reason. Her hands flew to his shoulders, gripping the rough fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself as the kiss deepened, consuming. The years of control, the isolation, the societal walls, the lies, they vaporized. There was only this, the shocking softness of his lips, the rough scrape of his stubble against her skin, the solid, unyielding strength of his body beneath hers, the intoxicating scent of him filling her senses, blood, sweat, cedar, and pure male heat. She yielded, arching against him, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at his nape, pulling him closer. A silent gasp echoed between them, swallowed by the kiss. His hands moved over her, one still gripping her waist possessively, the other sliding up her spine, tangling in the intricate braids at the back of her head, holding her captive to the onslaught of his mouth. His touch was rough, urgent, yet laced with a reverence that shattered her completely. He kissed her like a man starved, like a man drowning, and she met him with the same desperate intensity, pouring months of suppressed longing, fury, and bewildered attraction into the connection. He broke the kiss only to trail desperate, burning kisses along her jaw, down the column of her throat, finding the pulse point that hammered wildly beneath her skin. Seraphina gasped, her head falling back, offering him more. His groan vibrated against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Her own hands explored the hard planes of his back, the powerful shoulders, relearning the body she'd observed from afar, now hers to touch, to claim. The firelight danced over them, casting their entwined shadows large and flickering against the cold stone walls of the main hall. The only sounds were the ragged symphony of their breathing, the soft rustle of fabric, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional low groan or gasp that escaped their fused lips. The world outside, Blackridge Vale, the coal dust, the diamonds, ceased to matter. There was only this consuming fire, this desperate claiming, this wordless surrender to a force stronger than pride, stronger than resentment, stronger than any carefully constructed fortress. He stood suddenly, lifting her effortlessly in his arms. Seraphina clung to him, burying her face in the curve of his neck, breathing him in. He didn't carry her to her small, cold room. He carried her through the shadowed corridors, his stride purposeful, towards the heavy iron-bound door of his study, the vault, the heart of his hidden empire, and his isolation. He fumbled with the lock one-handed, his gaze never leaving hers, burning with possessive intensity. The door swung open. Horstoken fistichotwithring, he to a glittering silent room. The cold brilliance of the diamonds reflected the fire burning between them. He lowered her gently onto the thick, luxurious rug before the massive desk, the black velvet of a nearby display case, a stark backdrop to her dark skin. He followed her down, his body covering hers, his mouth finding hers again with renewed hunger. His hands, no longer hesitant, traced the curves beneath her dress, the rough calluses sending sparks across her skin. Buttons yielded under his urgent fingers, laces loosened. The yielding of fabric was a whisper lost in the storm of their breathing. Cool air touched her skin, followed instantly by the searing heat of his hands, his mouth. The smooth darkness of her skin against the pale, scarred planes of his torso was a breathtaking contrast. He explored her with a reverence that belied his earlier roughness, tracing the slope of her shoulder, the curve of her breast, the dip of her waist, as if memorizing her by touch. Seraphina arched into his touch, her own hands mapping the hard lines of his back, the powerful swell of his chest, the surprising softness of his hair. She touched the bandage on his forearm, a reminder of the wound that had brought them here, a symbol of the barriers breached. There were no words, only touch, only breath, only heat. Their joining was not a gentle merging, but a fierce collision, a claiming and a yielding that shook them both to the core. It was less about passion and more about desperate confirmation, a silent vow exchanged in the language of gasps and shared tremors. The cold diamonds watched, their icy fire relevant against the all-consuming heat generated by the reclusive air and his sacrificial bride, finally shattered and fused together on the floor of his gilded cage. The silence of the vault was filled with the sound of two lost souls finding harbor in the storm, their control irrevocably broken, their bond forged in fire and blood, and the terrifying beauty of surrender.
Chapter 4. Dawn. When it finally seeped through the high, narrow windows of the diamond study, found them not on the rug, but tangled together on the worn leather couch Silas had pulled close to the cold hearth. Seraphina lay half-sprawled across his chest, her head nestled in the hollow of his shoulder, one arm draped possessively over his waist. Silas's uninjured arm held her firmly against him, his other hand resting lightly on the curve of her hip, fingers tracing idle, possessive patterns on the bare skin revealed by her rumpled chemise. The diamonds glittered with cold indifference across the room, but the air hummed with a different kind of fire, the ember glow of aftermath, thick with shared breath, and the profound, wordless understanding that everything had changed. Seraphina stirred first, blinking against the weak grey light. The scent of him, cedar, clean linen, and something uniquely, intimately Silas, filled her senses. His heartbeat, a steady, reassuring rhythm against her ear, anchored her in a reality that felt both terrifyingly new and utterly inevitable. The fury over the diamonds, the resentment of the sacrifice, hadn't vanished, but they were muted, submerged beneath a deeper, more potent tide, the bone-deep knowledge of belonging. His arm tightened infinitesimally around her as she shifted, a silent question. She tilted her head back to look at him. He was already awake, watching her, his pale grey eyes no longer icy or conflicted, but holding a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. The perpetual tension had melted from his face, leaving it younger, softer in repose, though the strength in his jawline remained. A faint dusting of stubble shadowed his cheeks. He looked peaceful, a word she'd never associated with Silas Thorne. "Morning," he rumbled, his voice thick with sleep, rougher than ever, yet devoid of its former defensive edge. His thumb brushed her hip bone. "Morning," Seraphina murmured, her own voice husky. The simple word felt weighted, a covenant. She traced a faint, silvery scar on his collarbone with her fingertip. "How's the arm?" He flexed it cautiously beneath the makeshift bandage she tied after everything. "Negligible," he stated, but his gaze held hers, acknowledging the deeper wound that had been healed, compared to other sensations. A flush warmed Seraphina's cheeks. The memory of the night, the desperate claiming, the fierce tenderness that had followed, the raw vulnerability shared on the cold stone floor, and then the worn leather, washed over her. It hadn't been mere passion. It had been a fusion, a forging in fire. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. "Sensations, Mr. Thorne. Should I fetch the smelling salts? Or perhaps just more coal dust to remind you of simpler times?" A low chuckle vibrated in his chest, a sound so rare and rich it sent a fresh wave of warmth through her. His hand slid up to cup the back of her neck, pulling her down for a kiss that started soft, a gentle exploration, then deepened with a familiar banked heat. "Simplicity," he murmured against her lips when they parted, his breath warm on her skin, "is vastly overrated, Miss Vale. I find I prefer complexity." His thumb traced the line of her jaw, especially when it involves unexpected facets. The flirtation, tentative and laced with the shared secret of the diamonds, sent a thrill through her. It was a new language, born from the shattering of the old. "Facets," she echoed, raising an eyebrow, playing along. She traced the strong line of his brow. "Like discovering your reclusive miner harbors a rather dazzling secret, or that beneath all that brooding silence lies a man who kisses rather effectively." She couldn't resist the tease, a newfound power singing in her veins. His eyes darkened, a possessive gleam replacing the warmth. "Effectively," he rolled, pinning her gently beneath him, his body a solid, welcome weight. He braced himself on his elbows, caging her face. "Perhaps I require further opportunity to demonstrate proficiency." He dipped his head, his lips brushing the sensitive spot below her ear, making her shiver. Thoroughly. Wrapped in his discarded shirt, absurdly large, smelling overwhelmingly of him, Seraphina stood at the study window overlooking the courtyard. The single white rose still bloomed defiantly. Silas came up behind her, his bare chest warm against her back, his arms encircling her waist. He rested his chin on her hair. The simple gesture spoke volumes. "The rose," she said softly, leaning back into him. "It survives, against the odds," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple, like stubborn beauty finding root in barren ground. His arms tightened. "Like you," she turned in his embrace, facing him. The diamond cases glittered coldly behind him. The lie, the hidden wealth, still hung between them, a ghost not yet fully laid to rest. "Silas," she began, the name still feeling new, powerful on her tongue. "The diamonds, the deception." He didn't flinch. He met her gaze steadily, the warmth in his eyes tempered by seriousness. "I hid it," he said, his voice low. "Not just from you, from everyone. My father built this empire on secrecy and suspicion. It was the only way he knew, the only way I knew." He glanced towards the glittering stones, his expression unreadable. It felt like a curse, a gilded cage, easier to be the miner, to disappear into the grit. He looked back at her, his hand rising to cup her cheek. "Then you arrived, with your pride, your defiance, your unexpected warmth." His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "You didn't see the miner, Seraphina. Not really. You saw the man beneath the dust, and you challenged him, at every turn." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You forced me to see the cage, and then you offered the key." The isolation she'd sensed wasn't just physical. It was the burden of his inheritance, the loneliness of power concealed. Her anger softened, replaced by a fierce protectiveness. "It's still a fortune built on secrets," she said quietly. "It doesn't have to be," he countered, his gaze intense. "Not anymore. Not with you." He gestured around the opulent room, then towards the window, the bleak settlement below. "This wealth, it can be more than hidden stones. It can be—" He looked back at her, a question, a plea, in his eyes. "If you'll stay, help me reshape it." The offer wasn't just about money. It was about partnership, about trust. Seraphina looked at the man before her, no longer the myth, the miner, or the icy heir, but Silas, vulnerable, fierce,
Hers. She saw the stark beauty of Blackridge Vale through his eyes now, not just as desolation, but as a place starved for the very life his wealth could nurture. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat. The fortress could use some windows, Mr. Thorne, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, and perhaps a few more roses. The transformation began subtly, like spring forcing its way through frozen ground. The heavy silence of the stone lodge didn't vanish, but it changed. It became a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the soft rustle of pages as Seraphina read in the now unlocked study, by the scrape of Silas's pen as he worked at the massive desk, no longer hiding. Their gazes would meet across the room, hers dark and warm, his pale and softened, and a silent current would pass between them, a language of shared amusement, understanding or simmering desire. Seraphina moved through the fortress with a new fluidity. Her posture remained proud, but the rigid armor was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that radiated from within. She no longer just cleaned, she curated. Rich, emerald green velvet appeared as curtains in the parlor, banishing the perpetual gloom. A deep sapphire rug, thick and luxurious, warmed the flagstones in the main hall. Vibrant woven throws appeared on the worn leather couch in the study. She brought life into the cold stone, her dark skin and bright fabrics a constant vibrant contrast to the gray. Silas too emerged. He spent fewer hours away, and when he returned, he sought her out. He'd find her in the study, silently placing a cup of tea beside her book. He'd join her by the fire in the evenings, not speaking, but his presence a solid, comforting warmth. The perpetual frown eased. He watched her with open admiration, a possessiveness that was tender, not controlling. His pale eyes held only her. One morning, Seraphina descended to find him in the kitchen, an unusual sight. He was attempting to slice bread, his large hands surprisingly clumsy with the knife. A shower of crumbs littered the counter. Planning an assault on the loaf, Mr. Thorne? Seraphina leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, amusement dancing in her eyes. Or is this a new mining technique, crumbling resistance through sheer force? He scowled at the bread, then at her, but the effect was ruined by the warmth in his gaze. The crust is unyielding, he grumbled, soaring with renewed vigor, sending another spray of crumbs. Unlike certain individuals who distract the workforce. Distract. Seraphina pushed off the doorway and glided over, plucking the knife from his hand with effortless grace. Her fingers brushed his, sending the familiar jolt through them both. She picked up the loaf. Perhaps the workforce needs better tools. Or perhaps, she sliced through the crust with smooth efficiency, it needs to learn finesse over force. She handed him a perfectly sliced piece, her eyes meeting his, a challenge and a promise in their depths. He took the bread, his gaze dropping to her mouth. Finesse, he repeated, his voice dropping to that low, rough register that never failed to stir her. An intriguing concept. He took a slow bite, his eyes never leaving hers. Perhaps you could demonstrate further, later. The implication hung in the air, warm and potent. The banter, the easy flirtation woven into mundane moments, became their new currency. It was a dance, a constant, low thrum of awareness and shared desire that flavored their days. Must you rearrange the entire library, Miss Vale? He'd ask, finding her perched precariously on a ladder, reshelving books by some system known only to her. The chaos had a certain masculine charm. Masculine charm, Seraphina would retort, not looking down, her voice light. Is that what we're calling neglect and intellectual disarray now? How terribly convenient. Though, she'd glanced down, a spark in her eye. I suppose some prefer their diamonds uncut and scattered too. Less revealing. He'd just shake his head, a reluctant smile touching his lips, and steady the ladder. Her influence began to seep beyond the stone walls. She started small, using coin from the household allowance Silas now freely provided, an unspoken agreement. Warm woolen blankets appeared at the door of a miner's widow, a crate of sturdy boots for children, mysteriously delivered. Then bolder, she approached Silas one evening as he pored over maps in the study, not of diamond seams, but of the settlement. The schoolhouse roof, she stated, pointing to a spot on the map. It leaks, badly. The children learn in puddles. She met his gaze directly. Neglect has consequences. You said so yourself. He looked from the map to her face, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, a slow nod. See it done. No questions, no hesitation. It was the first of many such quiet commands. Seraphina, with the silent authority of the Lady of Blackridge Vale, though no title was spoken, became a discreet force for change. A proper doctor was persuaded to visit the settlement regularly, paid from an anonymous benefactor. The company store's extortionate prices were subtly challenged, fairer rates negotiated. She didn't flaunt the wealth, she used it like a surgeon's knife, precise and healing. The hidden study became their true sanctuary. They spent evenings there, Silas working at the desk, Seraphina reading in a deep armchair she'd commandeered, draped in one of the vibrant throws. Sometimes he'd rise, come over to her and simply take the book from her hands, pulling her up into a kiss that started slow and deepened into something that inevitably led them back to the couch, or the rug, or once, memorably, against the polished wood of the desk, diamonds glittering witness to their passion. One afternoon, Seraphina found him standing before the diamond display cases, not with the usual detached assessment, but with a thoughtful expression. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "Admiring your frozen fire, Mr. Thorne?" He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on a particularly large, flawless white diamond. "Cold fire," he murmured, "beautiful but lifeless." He turned to her then, his pale eyes capturing hers. Until now, he reached into the case, bypassing the largest stones, and picked up a smaller, exquisitely cut diamond, its facets catching the light and throwing rainbows onto the dark wood floor. It hung from a simple, almost invisible platinum chain. He held it up, the stone winking between his fingers. Seraphina's breath caught. It was breathtakingly beautiful. "Silas, not an empire," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just a stone." He stepped closer, but one that only makes sense. His free hand lifted to brush a stray curl from her temple, his touch tender, when it reflects warmth. He fastened the chain around her neck. The cool weight of the diamond settled against her skin, just above the neckline of her dress. It felt alien, yet strangely right, a symbol of his world offered to adorn hers. She touched the cool stone, then looked up at him, her eyes shining. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But Silas," she reached up, not to the diamond, but to touch his cheek. "The most precious thing in this room isn't in a case." He covered her hand on his cheek with his own, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "I know," he murmured against her skin. "She's standing right here." The Diamond Empire was no longer hidden. It was a tool, reshaped by their union. Seraphina's vision extended beyond immediate needs. She saw the potential in the Stark Valley, using Silas's resources, but guided by her understanding of the people and the land. Projects began. Repairs to the miners' cottages, plans for a proper bathhouse fed by a hot spring Silas knew of, and her most ambitious project, a large greenhouse, built against the southern wall of the lodge, its glass panes already ordered, promising defiance against the harsh climate, a space for life and color. The final piece came unexpectedly. Walking through the settlement with Silas one surprisingly mild afternoon, his presence alone, openly beside her, sent ripples of astonished respect. She stopped near the dilapidated schoolhouse. Children played in the muddy yard, their laughter a stark, beautiful contrast to the grime. She watched them, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss Vale?" Silas asked, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. "Planning the overthrow of the educational system, merely considering its foundation, Mr. Thorne," she replied, leaning slightly into his touch. "Knowledge shouldn't be learned ankle-deep in meltwater. A new schoolhouse, stone, solid, with large windows." She looked up at him, her dark eyes holding a challenge and a plea. Facing south, for the light, he looked from the shabby building to her face, then out over the valley, towards the ridge where his stone fortress stood. He saw not just coal dust and hardship, but the potential she saw, the future they could build. He squeezed her waist. "South," he agreed, his voice firm, "for the light." Months flowed into seasons. The stone lodge, once a fortress, became a home, warmed by shared laughter, heated debates over ledgers, and the constant simmering tension of their desire. The greenhouse bloomed, a riot of color against the gray stone, roses of every hue, vibrant lilies, herbs that scented the air. Seraphina's influence was everywhere, a vibrant tapestry woven into the fabric of Silas Thorne's world. One crisp autumn evening, as the setting sun painted the coal-dusted sky in streaks of fiery orange and molten gold, they stood together on the high ridge overlooking Blackridge Vale. Below, the settlement was transformed. New roofs gleamed faintly in the dying light. Smoke rose from repaired chimneys. The framework of the new schoolhouse stood sturdy and promising near the old one. The greenhouse glass glittered like a cluster of captured diamonds on the side of the lodge. Silas stood behind Seraphina, his arms wrapped securely around her, his chin resting on her hair. She leaned back against him, her body molded to his, warm and safe. The diamond pendant lay cool against her skin, a token, but not the source of her security. Around her neck, almost hidden, she also wore a small, dried white rose petal, encased in a simple glass locket. No words were spoken, none were needed. The wind carried the distant, happy shrieks of children playing, the rhythmic clang of the mine that now signified industry, not just exploitation, and the faint, sweet scent of greenhouse roses mingled with the crisp autumn air. Seraphina closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, of home, of a future forged in fire and tenderness. Silas pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his arms tightening. The desolate landscape, touched by the warmth of their union, held a stark, enduring beauty. The fortress walls still stood, but the gates were open. The diamond heir and his sacrificial bride had vanished. In their place stood Silas and Seraphina, bound by a love as unyielding as stone, as brilliant as the hardest diamond, and as unexpectedly life-giving as a rose blooming in coal dust. Their hearts beat a quiet, steady rhythm against each other, finally in perfect sync, watching the sun set on the world they were rebuilding together. One shared breath, one defiant bloom, one act of quiet love at a time. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of home.